The arrival at Somerset Grand. The Somerset Grand Hotel stood like a monument to opulence in the heart of the city, its white limestone facade gleaming under the midday sun. The long row of meticulously trimmed hedges guided visitors up a series of wide marble steps, leading to bronze revolving doors that shimmered with every rotation. A line of luxury cars was parked out front, their polished exteriors reflecting the grandeur of the hotel. 75-year-old David Marin, a decorated veteran, stood silently at the entrance, his sharp, hazel eyes taking in the sight before him. Decades of military service had left their marks. Deep lines carved into his dark skin, a silver streak running through his cropped hair, and a posture that remained impossibly straight despite the years. Next to him, Max, a golden retriever wearing a red service vest, sat attentively. His expressive brown eyes stayed locked on David, his faithful companion attuned to every flicker of anxiety his handler might feel. David clutched the handle of his travel bag with one hand and patted Max's head with the other. He knew today would be difficult. It always was. Traveling, even under the best circumstances, could be overwhelming. But with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, shadowing his every step, what might seem like a simple hotel stay felt more like crossing into enemy territory. "Let's get through this, buddy," David whispered. Max gave a soft huff, nudging his nose against David's leg as if to say, "I've got your back." The Somerset Grand was not the sort of place David usually stayed. He preferred small inns, unpretentious and quiet. But Roger Hargrove, a fellow soldier and an old friend he hadn't seen in years, had insisted on meeting here. "It's the least I can do for you," Roger had said over the phone. David relented, though he still harbored doubts. As he entered through the revolving doors, the plush scent of leather, flowers, and wood polish hit him. The lobby was a spectacle of modern elegance: white marble floors, glass chandeliers, and oversized art installations. Business people strode by in tailored suits, dragging sleek carry-ons. Families crowded near the concierge desk, planning sightseeing tours. But as David and Max crossed the threshold, the atmosphere subtly shifted. The conversations around them quieted as curious eyes flicked in their direction. Whispers followed, a ripple of murmurs that David could feel more than hear. He straightened his spine. An instinctive reaction hurled into him during his years in the military. Still, the weight of their stares settled over him like a heavy coat. Max leaned into David's side, his presence grounding and steadying him. With a sharp nod to himself, David approached the reception desk. A young woman with platinum blonde hair sat behind it, typing on her computer. She glanced up with a professional smile that faltered when she saw Max. Her gaze traveled from David's crisp military jacket, adorned with service medals, to the bright vest on the retriever. Her voice, when she finally spoke, carried a cool politeness. "Good afternoon, sir. How can I help you?" David adjusted the strap of his bag on his shoulder. "I have a reservation under Marin," he said. The receptionist's smile tightened as she scanned her computer. After a moment, she glanced back at Max. "Sir, pets aren't allowed in the hotel." David inhaled deeply, controlling the irritation that began to bubble in his chest. He'd dealt with this kind of encounter many times before. Max wasn't just a pet. He was his lifeline, trained to help with the panic attacks, hypervigilance, and night terrors that came with PTSD. "He's a service animal," David replied, his tone calm but firm. "I have his documentation right here." He pulled a worn folder from his jacket and placed it on the desk. The receptionist hesitated, her manicured nails tapping against the keyboard, before reluctantly opening the folder. Her frown deepened as she reviewed the papers. "These look legitimate," she muttered, more to herself than to David. "But I'll need to confirm this with the manager." David felt the familiar prickle of discomfort settle over him, the same prickling sensation that had haunted him in countless civilian spaces. Though the Americans with Disabilities Act granted him the right to have Max by his side, ignorance and hostility often meant constant battles for acceptance. The receptionist picked up the phone. her words muffled as she spoke with someone on the other end. She avoided eye contact with David, her lips pursed in disapproval. Max shifted beside him, sensing David's tension, and pressed his warm body against his leg in silent reassurance. The minutes stretched long. David stood like a sentinel, unmoving, patient, but the unease gnawed at him. The stares from other guests and staff made his skin itch. He closed his eyes briefly, grounding himself by focusing on the weight of Max's presence against him. Finally, the receptionist hung up the phone. "You'll be in room 324, she said flatly, sliding a key card across the counter as if it carried a disease. "Elevators are to your left." David pocketed the card, nodding curtly. "Thank you." The receptionist said nothing as he turned away, but David could feel the tension clinging to the air like static electricity. As he walked toward the elevators with Max at his side, the whispers began again. He kept his eyes straight ahead, unwilling to let the stares and murmurs drag him down. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. David stepped inside, pressing the button for the third floor. As the doors closed, he caught a glimpse of the receptionist speaking with another employee, her face twisted in a sneer. He knew that look all too well, the subtle, practiced disdain of someone who saw him as less than. The doors sealed shut, and David let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He leaned against the wall, rubbing the back of his neck. "We're here now, Max," he murmured. "That's half the battle." Max sat quietly at his feet, his warm eyes never leaving David's face. The simple loyalty in that gaze gave David strength. The years of military service, the sleepless nights, the battles fought both overseas and within his own mind, none of that mattered to Max. He was simply there, an unwavering friend in a world that often felt too heavy to bear alone. The elevator dinged, announcing their arrival at the third floor. David squared his shoulders and stepped out, Max padding faithfully beside him. When they reached room 324, David swiped the key card and opened the door. It swung inward with a soft click, revealing a modest room with beige walls, a queen-size bed, and a window that faced a brick alley. David sighed. He knew from experience that this room wasn't likely the one he was originally assigned. More likely, it was a deliberate downgrade, a subtle gesture meant to make him feel unwelcome. He set his suitcase down and gave Max the command to check the room. The retriever trotted inside, sniffing methodically as David unpacked his things. The familiarity of the routine calmed him, grounding him in the moment. He and Max had been through worse than an inhospitable hotel staff. They would get through this, too. Max returned, his inspection complete, and nudged David's leg with his nose. David crouched down, rubbing the dog's ears. "Good job, buddy. We've got this." As he finished unpacking, the frustration that had simmered beneath the surface began to fade. Max's steady presence reminded him that he wasn't alone in this fight. He'd faced combat zones, loss, and trauma. A rude receptionist and a downgraded room wouldn't break him. "Let's rest for a bit," David said softly. "Then we'll see what this place has to offer." Max gave a soft wag of his tail in agreement, and for the first time since arriving at the Somerset Grand, David allowed himself to smile. The manager's challenge. David Marin and Max stood together in the hotel hallway, absorbing Anita's kindness like a breath of fresh air. After exchanging a few more words, they moved on, grateful for at least one moment of decency in an otherwise uncomfortable experience. David was hoping things might improve, but as they reached the lobby to head out for a walk, his day took another unwelcome turn. As David exited the elevator with Max trotting beside him, a man with slicked back hair and a self-assured smirk blocked their path. His dark suit, polished shoes, and the slight sneer at the corner of his mouth radiated superiority. The golden name tag on his chest read, "Elliot Grant, Hotel Manager." "Mr. Marin, I presume." Grant's voice was smooth but laced with condescension. "I believe we need to have a little chat about our hotel's policies." David stiffened, He had dealt with men like this before, self-important and overly concerned with status. They were bullies in different packaging, and David's military instincts kicked in, warning him to stay on alert. "I was on my way out," David said evenly, keeping his voice calm and polite. "This won't take long," Grant assured, though his smug tone suggested otherwise. He crossed his arms and gave Max a once-over, his expression souring. "As I'm sure you know, the Vora Hotel prides itself on offering a refined experience. While I understand the value of service animals for certain individuals, I do have to remind you that our clientele expects a particular ambience." David's jaw clenched. "Max is my service dog. He's well-trained and has every right to be here under federal law." Grant gave a thin, insincere smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. Yes. I'm aware of the Americans with Disabilities Act, Mr. Marin, but surely you understand that not all guests are comfortable sharing spaces with animals. Some might have allergies, others, well, let's just say that they prefer not to have. Distractions, David repeated slowly. Max sat calmly by his side, sensing his owner's tension, but remaining perfectly still. Grant ignored the edge in David's voice. "I simply want to ensure that everyone has a pleasant experience during their stay. We wouldn't want any situations, now would we?" David stared at the man, the insinuation clear as day. "I don't think you understand how service animals work," he said coldly. "Max isn't here for anyone else's convenience. He's here for mine. And trust me, he's a lot less disruptive than some of the guests you cater to." Grant's smile faltered, but his tone sharpened. "I'm just asking that you be mindful, Mr. Marin. If you insist on staying, there are certain expectations, discretion, for one. I can arrange for your dog to enter and exit through the service entrance at the back of the hotel. We'll have staff escort you so it doesn't alarm anyone." David felt a flicker of disbelief. He had been subjected to ignorance before, but this level of arrogance was staggering. "Let me get this straight," David said, keeping his voice measured but firm. "You want me and my service dog to use the service entrance, the one reserved for laundry carts and trash." Grant spread his hands as if it were the most reasonable request in the world. "Just for everyone's comfort. I'm sure you can understand." David's heart pounded in his chest. Decades of military training allowed him to remain outwardly calm, but inside he was seething. In combat, enemies wore uniforms. You knew who you were dealing with. But here, the enemy was disguised in polite smiles and expensive suits. "I'll tell you what, Mr. Grant," David said quietly, leaning in just enough to make the man flinch. "I fought for this country so people like you have the right to say whatever ignorant thing crosses your mind, but that doesn't mean I have to listen to it." Grant's face twitched, a flash of anger crossing his features. "If you refuse to cooperate, I will have to escalate this, Mr. Marin. Non-compliance with hotel management could lead to—" "You do what you have to," David interrupted, his voice steady and unyielding. "And I'll do what I have to. Starting with making a few calls to the ADA office and some friends in the media." For a moment, the two men locked eyes, the tension crackling between them. Grant's jaw tightened, but he seemed to realize that pushing David further might create more trouble than it was worth. Without another word, the manager stepped aside, his expression sour. "Enjoy your walk," Grant muttered through gritted teeth. David gave him a slight nod, more of a dismissal than a courtesy. "I will." A walk through the storm. As David and Max exited the hotel, the cool evening breeze washed over them, carrying the scent of rain on the horizon. They walked in silence for a while, the tension from the encounter with Grant still lingering. David's hands were balled into fists at his sides, his shoulders stiff. Max glanced up at him from time to time, his brown eyes calm and reassuring. The streets were quieter now, with only a few tourists wandering about. David inhaled deeply, focusing on the rhythm of his footsteps and the sound of Max's paws clicking softly against the pavement. Walking with Max always helped ease his anxiety. But tonight, the storm inside him raged on. He hated that he let people like Grant get under his skin. After all he had endured, the battles, the loss, the trauma, why did the subtle cruelties of ordinary life cut so deep? It wasn't just about the rude manager or the indifferent receptionist. It was the constant reminder that even after everything he had given, he still had to fight for basic decency. David stopped at a small park bench and sat down heavily, rubbing his temples. Max immediately pressed against his side, anchoring him to the present moment. "You're right, boy," David muttered, scratching Max behind the ears. "I can't let him get to me. I've faced worse." He closed his eyes and focused on the sounds around him. The rustling leaves, the distant honk of a car horn, the faint laughter of passers-by. Slowly, his heart rate began to steady. Max nuzzled his hand, a silent reminder that he wasn't alone. David smiled faintly. "At least I've got you, that's more than enough." They stayed like that for a while, David lost in thought, and Max content just to be by his side. When the first drops of rain began to fall, they reluctantly made their way back toward the hotel. The shift in perspective. As they entered the hotel lobby again, David braced himself for more unpleasant encounters. But this time, something unexpected happened. Anita, the kind housekeeper from earlier, spotted them from across the room. With a bright smile, she waved them over. "Hey, Mr. Marin, how was your walk?" she asked warmly. "It was just what we needed," David replied, grateful for her kindness. Anita knelt down to scratch behind Max's ears. "You take good care of him, don't you, handsome?" David felt a knot in his chest loosen. Sometimes it only took one kind person to remind him that not everyone saw the world through the same narrow lens as people like Grant. "You're a good man, Mr. Marin," Anita said, standing up. "And Max, he's lucky to have you." "No," David said quietly, watching Max wag his tail. "I'm the lucky one." Anita gave him a knowing smile and wished him a good night. As David and Max made their way to the elevator, a thought occurred to him. Maybe he didn't need to change the world or fight every battle. Maybe it was enough to hold on to the good moments and the kind people he met along the way. And maybe, just maybe, people like Grant weren't as powerful as they seemed. The elevator doors closed, and as they ascended to their floor, David felt lighter. He wasn't just a man with a service dog or a veteran with PTSD. He was someone who had fought for his place in the world, and won. And that was something no hotel manager could ever take away. Max leaned against him, and David smiled. "Let's get some sleep, boy. Tomorrow's another day." And no matter what came next, they would face it together. Echoes of the past. The next morning, David woke to a dull ache behind his eyes. Sleep had come, but the memories followed, weaving themselves into restless dreams. He ran a hand over his face, exhaling slowly. The past had a way of creeping in when he least expected it, stirring up emotions he'd spent years learning how to manage. But there was no point dwelling on things he couldn't change. Not today. Max, already awake, gave a quiet whine and placed his head on the edge of the bed, his brown eyes full of concern. Yeah, I'm up," David muttered, ruffling the dog's ears affectionately. "Another day in paradise, right?" He sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, grounding himself. The hotel room was quiet, the hum of the air conditioner the only sound. But in his mind, the silence was filled with distant echoes. Gunfire, shouted orders, and the metallic hum of military helicopters. Years had passed since his last deployment, but the memories still lingered, just out of reach, like an old scar you could feel even when you couldn't see it. Max gave him another nudge, pulling David from the fog of his thoughts. "All right, breakfast," David said, rising from the bed. "Let's get some food in you." A not-so-warm welcome. David clipped Max's vest on, grabbed his room key, and they headed to the hotel's dining area. The restaurant was a plush space with gleaming chandeliers and tables adorned with white linen. Guests chatted quietly over their meals, sipping orange juice or scrolling through their phones. As David entered with Max at his side, a hostess behind the podium looked up. Her polite smile faltered the moment she saw the dog. Sir, pets aren't allowed in the dining room," she said, her eyes flickering nervously between David and Max. David's expression remained neutral. "He's not a pet. He's a service animal." The hostess shifted uncomfortably, clearly caught between hotel policies and the awkwardness of the situation. Before she could respond, a familiar, unwelcome voice interrupted. "Good morning, Mr. Marin." David turned to see Elliot Grant, the hotel manager, striding toward him. The smugness from the night before still clung to him like cologne. "I see you're determined to enjoy our amenities. Of course, we aim to accommodate all our guests." Grant glanced at Max with a forced smile. "But we do ask that you be mindful of the dining room rules." David clenched his jaw, but forced himself to remain calm. The law allows service animals anywhere the public is permitted, including restaurants. Yes, Grant replied smoothly. "But we wouldn't want any misunderstandings with the other guests." David's patience was wearing thin. He wasn't in the mood to explain himself to someone who didn't care. He glanced down at Max, who sat calmly, his presence grounding David once more. "Let's go, buddy," David muttered, turning away from the manager. He wasn't about to waste his time battling hotel staff over breakfast. As he left the dining room, he heard murmurs from nearby tables, whispers about the man with the dog, the one who didn't seem to belong. The words stung, but David had long grown used to them. He wasn't here to please anyone. Memories that refused to fade. David and Max found a small park, a few blocks from the hotel. They sat on a bench under the shade of an old oak tree, a small to-go coffee cup in David's hand, and a water dish at Max's paws. The quiet hum of the city surrounded them. Children laughing in the distance, birds chirping in the branches above. But in David's mind, memories stirred again, uninvited. He remembered the sound of boots on gravel, the heat of the desert sun on his back, and the weight of his gear as he crouched in the dust, waiting for orders. He remembered the faces of his squad, good men and women who'd fought beside him, some of whom hadn't made it back. The worst part wasn't the fighting. It was what came after, the silence, the feeling of being adrift, like a ship cut loose from its anchor. Civilians saw the uniform and the medals, but they didn't see the nights spent wide awake, haunted by the things he couldn't unsee. A group of kids playing nearby sent a soccer ball rolling toward them. Max perked up, his tail wagging eagerly. David reached down and gave the ball a gentle nudge with his foot, sending it back toward the children. They giggled, waving a thank you as they resumed their game. David smiled faintly, grateful for the small moment of normalcy, a voice from the past. As they made their way back to the hotel, David's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a familiar name on the screen, Captain Sarah Delgado. David hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hey, Captain," he said, his voice lighter than it had been all day. "David," Sarah's voice crackled through the line, warm and familiar. "I thought I'd check in on you. How's civilian life treating you?" David chuckled. "You know how it is. Same old battles, different battlefield." Sarah laughed softly. "I hear that. I just wanted to remind you. You've got people in your corner, David. Don't forget that." David glanced down at Max, who was trotting happily beside him, oblivious to the weight his presence lifted every day. "Yeah," David said quietly. "I know." They exchanged a few more words before hanging up. David slipped the phone back into his pocket, feeling lighter than he had in days. Sarah's call was a reminder that even though his world had shifted, he wasn't alone. He had Max, he had friends, and he had himself, scared, maybe, but still standing. An unexpected apology. When they returned to the hotel, David was surprised to find Anita waiting for them near the front desk. Her usual cheerful expression was tinged with concern. "Mr. Marin," she began, fidgeting with the edge of her uniform. "I heard what happened earlier with Mr. Grant. I just wanted to say I'm really sorry. Not everyone here sees things the way he does." David offered her a small smile. "It's not your fault, Anita. Thanks for saying that, though." She knelt to pet Max, who greeted her with an enthusiastic tail wag. "You two are always welcome here, as far as I'm concerned." David felt the knot in his chest loosen a little more. Kindness had a way of cutting through the noise of the world, reminding him that not every battle needed to be fought with fists or words. A quiet victory. That night, as David lay in bed with Max curled up on the floor beside him, he felt a strange sense of peace. The battles he fought now weren't as clear-cut as the ones overseas. They were quieter, more personal, but they were no less important. And in those quiet victories, in the kindness of strangers, the wag of a tail, and the voice of an old friend, David found something worth holding on to. Max let out a soft sigh in his sleep, and David smiled in the darkness. "Tomorrow's another day, buddy," he whispered. And together, they would face it, one step at a time. Fault lines beneath the surface. The next day dawned with the sky a dull gray, clouds swirling above like they couldn't decide whether to rain or not. David pulled back the curtains of his hotel room, feeling the weight of another restless night in his bones. Sleep had come in fractured segments. Images of old battles, lost comrades, and desert skies blending into the sterile quiet of this strange, urban existence. Max stretched on the floor, giving a mighty yawn, then trotted over to David, his tail wagging softly. A lifeline, always present. David leaned down to ruffle the fur behind Max's ears. "Morning, partner," he said. "Let's go see what trouble we can avoid today." After a quick breakfast from a street vendor, a couple of egg sandwiches, and some black coffee, they walked back toward the park they'd discovered the day before. The air smelled faintly of damp pavement and fallen leaves. It was one of those mornings that felt heavy with unspoken things, like a storm waiting to break. A familiar kind of stranger. The park was quieter than it had been yesterday. Max sniffed eagerly along the trail, while David let his thoughts wander. He was mid-step when he noticed someone sitting on a bench just ahead. A man in his mid-30s, wearing an old military jacket that had seen better days. David's instincts sharpened instantly, recognizing the signs. The way the man's shoulders slumped, the nervous glance he shot at passersby, and the tension in his jaw. It was all too familiar. A fellow veteran, no doubt. Someone caught in the same in-between world David knew all too well, not quite part of civilian life, but no longer in the field. Max noticed the man too, his tail wagging as if he sensed something beneath the surface. David hesitated for a moment, then walked over slowly. "You mind if I sit?" David asked, gesturing toward the empty spot on the bench. The man gave a half-hearted shrug. "It's a free park." David took a seat, letting the silence settle between them like a truce. Max sat at his feet, calm and patient. They sat like that for a long moment, watching the park's quiet rhythm. "Name's David," he finally said, breaking the silence. The man glanced sideways at him. "Eli," he muttered. David gave a nod. "Army." Eli's eyes flickered with something. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. "Marines," he said. "You?" "Army. Afghanistan." Eli gave a humorless chuckle. "Iraq." And just like that, they understood each other. No need for long explanations. No need to rehash things best left buried. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence shared between people who knew the same ghosts. An unexpected bond. Max, ever the social one, nudged Eli's hand with his nose. The Marine blinked, then gave the dog a tentative pat. A small smile cracked his otherwise grim expression. "Good dog," Eli murmured, scratching behind Max's ears. "He's a lifesaver," David said, meaning every word. "Been with me through thick and thin." Eli gave a slow nod, still focused on Max. "Wish I had one of these back when things got bad," he admitted, his voice low, would have made a difference. David knew exactly what he meant. Sometimes it wasn't about talking through the pain or finding the perfect therapist. Sometimes it was about having someone, there to keep you grounded when your mind tried to pull you under. They sat in companionable silence for a while, two men who had walked through hell and found themselves back on unfamiliar ground. "I know a group," David said after a while, his voice casual. "Veterans meet once a week. Talk if they want, sit in silence if they don't. No pressure. You might like it." Eli gave him a sideways glance, his expression guarded. "You go." David shrugged. "Sometimes it helps." Eli didn't respond right away, but David could tell he was thinking about it. That was good enough for now. Sometimes just planting the idea was the first step. Clash with Grant, round 2. Back at the hotel, David was greeted by the unwelcome sight of Elliot Grant standing near the front desk, clipboard in hand. The manager's thin smile faltered when he saw David and Max approach. "Mr. Marin," Grant said, his voice laced with false cheer, "I trust you're enjoying your stay." David fought the urge to roll his eyes. "It's been fine." Grant's gaze dropped to Max, and the faintest flicker of annoyance crossed his features. "I hope there haven't been any disruptions." David clenched his jaw. "We've been minding our business." Grant gave a tight-lipped smile. "Good to hear. But just so we're clear, hotel policy does require that animals, even service animals, remain on a leash at all times." David's eyes narrowed. "He is on a leash," he said, keeping his voice steady. "Yes, well," Grant said, tapping his clipboard, "we've had some feedback from other guests. I just wanted to ensure there won't be any further concerns." David could feel the tension coiling in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. Losing his temper wouldn't solve anything, and it sure as hell wouldn't help Max. "We're not causing any problems," David said evenly. "If your guests have an issue, maybe you should remind them that service dogs are protected under federal law." Grant gave a thin smile. "Of course. Just doing my job, Mr. Marin." David gave him a curt nod and walked away, Max trotting faithfully at his side. He had no patience for people like Grant, people who followed the letter of the rules without understanding their spirit. A quiet evening, a heavy heart. Later that night, David sat on the small balcony attached to his room, nursing a beer and watching the city lights flicker in the distance. Max lay beside him, his head resting on David's foot. The conversation with Eli lingered in his mind, along with Grant's passive-aggressive attitude. It was the same story, over and over. Some people understood, and others never would. The world was full of fault lines, cracks running beneath the surface of everyday life. Some people fell through those cracks and never found their way back. Others, like David, spent every day trying to stay upright, knowing that at any moment the ground could give way beneath them. But tonight, he wasn't falling. Not yet. He reached down to ruffle Max's fur, grateful for the steady presence beside him. "Thanks, buddy," David murmured. "Don't know what I'd do without you." Max gave a soft huff, as if to say, "I've got your back always." David smiled and took another sip of his beer. The night stretched out before them, quiet and calm. And for now, that was enough. The road ahead would never be easy. There would be more Grants, more battles, more ghosts. But there would also be Eli and Sarah and people like Anita, people who saw the cracks and offered a hand to steady him. And as long as Max was by his side, David knew he could face whatever came next. One day at a time, one step at a time. Because that's what survivors do. They keep going. Shadows of the past, lights of the present. The next few days followed a familiar rhythm. Mornings began with coffee and quiet walks through the city's hidden parks, Max trotting happily beside David. Afternoons were spent navigating the intricacies of urban life. Brief conversations with strangers, errands, and trying not to feel like an outsider in a world that had moved on without him. Each day brought small encounters: a kind barista offering Max a free biscuit, a bus driver with a knowing nod when David stepped aboard, subtle reminders that not everyone saw him as a problem. But between those moments, the silence could be suffocating. The ghosts of old missions, unfinished goodbyes, and comrades lost in the desert clung to David like shadows. Always there, always just beneath the surface. It was during one of these quiet stretches that Sarah called. "Hey, stranger." Her voice was warm, easy, as if they'd talked just yesterday instead of months ago. "You alive out there?" David leaned against the windowsill, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Still breathing." "Good to hear," Sarah replied. "You owe me dinner, you know. When are you coming back to the real world?" He exhaled slowly, unsure of how to answer. Returning to normal life was complicated, if there even was such a thing as normal anymore. "Soon, maybe," he said vaguely. "Just sorting some things out." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Take your time, David, but don't wait too long, okay? The world can't wait forever for you to come back." "I know." They chatted for a little longer, the conversation light and familiar, like a lifeline tossed out over dark waters. When the call ended, David felt lighter somehow, like a part of the weight he carried had shifted, if only slightly. An offer he couldn't refuse. That evening, as David sat in a hotel lobby with a paper map unfolded in front of him, a familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. "Planning your escape route." He looked up to find Anita standing there, a grin on her face. The sight of her, so full of energy and curiosity, was a welcome reprieve from the heaviness that had settled in his chest. "Something like that," David said, folding the map neatly. Anita took a seat across from him, her eyes flickering briefly to Max, who perked up at the sight of her. "You know, I've been thinking," she said, crossing her legs. "There's this veterans event tomorrow, a charity run, but they need volunteers. I told them I might know a guy." David arched an eyebrow. "You trying to recruit me?" Anita shrugged, an innocent smile playing on her lips. "It's for a good cause, and they're short on people." David hesitated. He didn't exactly have a good track record with public events. Crowds made him uneasy, the noise too chaotic, too unpredictable. But something about Anita's invitation, her gentle persistence, made it hard to say no. "All right," he said at last. "What time?" 8 a.m. sharp, Anita replied, beaming. "You won't regret it, I promise." The charity run. The next morning, the park was alive with activity. Tents were being set up. Volunteers bustled around carrying supplies, and runners stretched in preparation for the race. David stood near the registration table, feeling a bit out of place, but trying not to let it show. Max, of course, was in his element, sniffing every new scent, wagging his tail at strangers, and soaking up all the attention. "David, you made it." Anita's voice cut through the noise, and he turned to see her waving him over. "Come on, we need help setting up the water stations." David followed her lead, grateful to have something to do with his hands. The morning passed in a blur of small tasks: filling water cups, directing runners, and making sure Max stayed out of the way of sprinting athletes. At one point, Eli showed up, wearing a hesitant expression that mirrored David's from earlier. He gave David a nod of acknowledgement, and they exchanged a brief smile, a silent understanding that said, "We're in this together." A moment of reflection. The event went smoother than David had expected, and by the time the last runner crossed the finish line, a sense of quiet satisfaction settled over him. For once, he didn't feel like he was watching life from the sidelines. He was part of something, however small, and it felt good. As the crowd began to disperse, David found a quiet corner to sit and catch his breath. Max plopped down beside him, panting happily. Anita appeared a few moments later, holding 2 water bottles. "Not bad, huh?" she said, handing him one. David nodded, taking a sip. "Not bad at all." Anita smiled. "See, told you it'd be worth it." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the remnants of the event being packed away. "Thanks for dragging me here," David said eventually. "Any time," Anita replied, giving him a playful nudge. "Besides, someone had to make sure you didn't stay cooped up in that hotel forever." David chuckled softly, the sound feeling strange but welcome. For the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope, like maybe, just maybe, things could get better. New horizons. Later that evening, as David and Max walked back to the hotel, he felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. The city lights shimmered in the distance, casting long shadows across the pavement. But this time, the shadows didn't feel quite so heavy. He thought about the people he'd met: Eli, Anita, even Grant in his annoying way. They were part of the patchwork of his new reality, pieces that didn't quite fit but somehow made sense when put together. And then there was Max, always by his side, a constant reminder that no matter how difficult the road ahead might be, he wasn't walking it alone. As they reached the hotel, David paused for a moment, looking up at the building's facade. He knew now that this wasn't the end of the road. It was just another stop along the way. He glanced down at Max, who looked up at him with expectant eyes. "Come on, buddy," David said softly. "Let's see what tomorrow brings." Max wagged his tail, as if to say, "I'm ready when you are." And with that, they stepped inside, ready to face whatever came next. One day at a time, one step at a time. Together, a spark rekindled. The next morning greeted David with pale sunlight filtering through the hotel curtains, casting soft golden lines across the room. He stirred from a surprisingly restful sleep, his body heavy with the satisfying fatigue that followed a day spent with purpose. Max lay curled at the foot of the bed, snoring quietly, a small comfort against the background noise of the city waking up. David's mind drifted to the charity run and the simple joy of doing something useful again. The conversations, the camaraderie, however brief, had planted a thought he hadn't entertained in a long time. What if this could be more than just surviving? As the morning stretched on, he felt something he hadn't in a while, a pull to be more involved, to re-enter the stream of life rather than standing by the edges. But that old fear lurked beneath the surface too, whispering doubts. What if I can't fit in? What if I make the wrong move? The question gnawed at him throughout breakfast. While Max happily devoured his bowl of food, David sat at the small table, pushing toast around his plate. His hands itched to do something meaningful. But what? Anita's words echoed in his head. "Don't wait too long. The world can't wait forever." By the time noon rolled around, David knew he needed to act. Maybe just one more step, something small, a way to test if the spark from the charity run could turn into something lasting. The coffee shop encounter. He decided to visit a nearby coffee shop Anita had recommended, a cozy nook with vintage furniture and walls plastered in posters for local events. David figured it was as good a place as any to clear his thoughts and maybe find a clue about what came next. The cafe was buzzing with life. Students hunched over laptops, friends shared quiet conversations, and the scent of espresso filled the air. David ordered a black coffee, grabbed a table by the window, and let himself relax into the hum of normalcy. Max, lying obediently at his feet, earned a few curious glances and smiles. One passerby, a young woman with a notepad tucked under her arm, paused to kneel beside him. "Beautiful dog," she said, scratching Max behind the ears. "What's his name?" "Max," David replied. She smiled. "He looks like he's been through some adventures." David chuckled softly. "You have no idea." They exchanged a few more pleasantries before she wished him a good day and moved on. But the brief encounter left David feeling lighter. Small moments like this reminded him that maybe reconnecting with the world didn't have to be complicated. As he sipped his coffee, David's eyes landed on a community bulletin board near the counter. Flyers for art shows, guitar lessons, and group therapy sessions crowded the space. One, in particular, caught his attention. a flyer for a volunteer organization offering mentorship for veterans re-entering civilian life. Help others find their way. Maybe find your own. The tagline hit a nerve. David stared at it for a long moment, then pulled the flyer from the board and folded it into his pocket. Old memories, new decisions. The afternoon passed slowly. David returned to the hotel, but the flyer weighed heavily on his mind. Volunteering as a mentor. That seemed like a stretch. He was still figuring out his own place in the world. How could he possibly help someone else find theirs? But the thought wouldn't leave him alone. As night fell and the city's lights blinked on, he found himself sitting on the bed, the flyer unfolded in his hands. Max lay beside him, his head resting on David's thigh, as if sensing the importance of the moment. David thought back to his early days in the military. He'd been young, full of energy, but completely lost in the chaos of a new life. It was his first squad leader, Sergeant Bowen, who had pulled him through, offering guidance without judgment, teaching him to embrace the challenges instead of fearing them. Bowen's words echoed now across the years. We all need someone to walk beside us, especially when we forget how to walk alone. Maybe it was time to pass that lesson along. The first step forward. The next morning, David made the call. The woman on the other end of the line, Claire, greeted him warmly. We're always grateful to have volunteers, she said. You'll be working with veterans who are transitioning back into civilian life. People who need someone who understands the unique challenges they face. David nodded, though she couldn't see it. What kind of commitment are we talking about? Claire's voice was kind but direct. We can work around your schedule. Some volunteers meet weekly with their mentees, others bi-weekly or monthly. The important thing is consistency. Just showing up makes a world of difference. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision settle over him. But there was also a strange sense of relief, like he was finally answering a question that had been hanging in the air for too long. I'll give it a try, David said. Wonderful, Claire replied. We'll schedule an orientation session next week. I think you'll find the experience rewarding. After the call ended, David sat quietly for a moment, absorbing what he'd just committed to. It felt like stepping into unknown territory again, both exhilarating and terrifying. But for the first time in a long while, he wasn't running away. A new kind of mission. The days leading up to the orientation passed in a blur of preparation. David found himself going over old memories, revisiting lessons he'd learned during his years in service, and thinking about how they might apply to someone starting fresh. Max seemed to sense the change in David's demeanor, his wagging tail and bright eyes a constant source of encouragement. Each walk through the city felt lighter, each step less burdened by the past. When the day of the orientation arrived, David felt ready, not just for the session, but for what lay beyond it. As he stood at the entrance to the small office where the organization was based, he glanced down at Max, who looked up at him with unwavering trust. Ready, buddy? David asked softly. Max gave a happy bark, his tail thumping against the ground. With a small smile, David pushed open the door. This was a new kind of mission, one without clear objectives or guaranteed outcomes. But it was a mission worth taking. And this time, he wasn't doing it alone. The road ahead. Over the weeks that followed, David found himself growing into his new role. Mentoring wasn't easy. Each mentee came with their own struggles and stories, but it was deeply fulfilling. He discovered that simply listening, offering encouragement, and sharing a laugh could make all the difference. He also realized something else. Every step he took toward helping others was a step toward healing himself. The memories of his past still lingered, but they no longer felt like anchors dragging him down. Instead, they became markers of a journey, one that had brought him here, to this new beginning. Anita, Eli, and the others remained part of his world, each playing a small but meaningful role in his story. And through it all, Max stayed by his side, a constant reminder that life, like any good journey, was best traveled with a loyal friend. David didn't know exactly where the road would lead, But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid to find out. And that was enough.